twice-dead King Cainnith had ruled the kingdom of Gel for some time now, over a decade, with his love, Juliana, by his side. He was a strong and just kingdom that truly loved his people and had their love and respect, even the common folk. Before becoming the king, he was but a soldier and the bastard son of a noble house. Cainnith was assigned to Juliana when she was still just a princess, guarding her with his life. It was in those years that they grew closer and eventually fell in love. They hid their affections for one another from the world for fear of what consequences may befall Cainnith, but her father knew the truth. Juliana's father watched many suitors attempt to win her favor, but she turned them all away. Juliana's father watched until he grew tired of the charade they were putting forth and hatched a plan of his own. He told Juliana that he promised her hand to one of the noble houses that was their strongest ally. She protested, but he would hear nothing of it. In short order, the wedding was arranged and the day had come. Cainnith was to be a guard at the wedding. Juliana's father saw to that. When the priest had asked if anyone knew why the two should not be wed, those in attendance simply looked around to see if anyone would speak up. A moment of silence that seemed to last an eternity between Juliana and Cainnith came and went before Cainnith burst forth with his objection to the marriage. Cainnith's hand hovered just over his sword as he looked around to see if any of his fellow soldiers would attempt to remove him from the chapel, but unbeknownst to him, the other guards were already given instruction to leave him be. Juliana's father gave a hearty laugh, as did the noble that Juliana was seemingly promised to. Both she and Cainnith were confused on the matter as they looked at each other. The king walked up to Cainnith and nodded. Still confused, Cainnith nodded back before the king made a gesture for him to go to Juliana. Cainnith complied, and upon reaching her, he took her hands in his and gazed into her eyes for a long while before noticing that the noble she had been promised to had gone and sat down in the crowd. Both Cainnith and Juliana looked around the room before the priest started the ceremony over again. That's when the entire thing had made sense to them. This was their wedding. Years passed, and during his time as king, Cainnith saw war. He led his soldiers upon the front lines for months, sending letters back and forth to his love, Juliana, to keep her informed of what was happening as she ruled the kingdom while he protected it. The one to guard her now was a good friend of Cainnith's. They had served together as soldiers before Cainnith's time as king. The war with a neighboring kingdom was back and forth, give and take for some time as the fighting kept going. But it wasn't until Cainnith had been seriously wounded in a battle that he would see the truest colors of the ones he thought his friends come forth. While resting in a tent in an effort to regain his strength, Cainnith was attacked by lieutenants of his forces. The two men that attacked him, Thorin and Deverin, were loyal to the plans and ambitions of Miliardo, the man Cainnith had left to watch over Juliana and protect her while he was away at war. Cainnith managed to fend the two off, but he no longer had trust in any of his own soldiers. He had no way of knowing which, or even how many of them, had shifted their allegiance to Miliardo. Cainnith slipped out of his own military camp in the dead of night, still wounded, moving as fast as his injured body would allow him to until he collapsed and fell unconscious from the exhaustion. When Cainnith awoke, he was in an unfamiliar place and was immediately on edge. A woman was coming in with a bowl of water and seemed very relieved that he was awake. She explained to Cainnith that he had been unconscious for over a week and that she wasn't sure if he would even continue to draw breath. She told him about how his death was reported to the kingdom and that Miliardo seized power for himself. There had been little word of what happened to the queen, but when last spoken of, she seemed to be in good health, at least physically. It took almost 2 months for Cainnith to make a full recovery. All the while this woman tended to his wounds and gave him reports of what had been happening both with the war and with Miliardo. It seemed that almost as if on cue the attacking kingdom had started to withdraw after Cainnith's death had been reported. The whole matter stunk of treason and deception on a multitude of different levels, and all it did was anger Cainnith. After taking the proper time to recover, he took to training to ensure that his skill with a blade had not dulled any, for what was to come next would surely call for bloodshed. For this bit of training, he took an additional 2 weeks of training to ensure himself that he was healed enough to take on this next task. Before heading toward his next battle, though, Cainnith stopped and asked the woman why she had taken the time to nurse him back to health when it seemed the entire kingdom had turned their backs to him and embraced Miliardo. The woman confessed that her husband was a soldier of the kingdom before his death and served alongside Cainnith before his time as king. She told him about a time when noble houses were dueling and instead of putting their own lives at risk, they used the soldiers. Her husband was being forced to be a noble's champion and he had chosen Cainnith as his second. Her husband often spoke of that duel and always said that Cannith had been the only reason that he survived. The champion of the opposing noble house was a well-known and renowned fighter that had won many duels in his time. Her husband had become injured during the duel, and instead of conceding to defeat, Cannith took up her husband's sword and fended off both of his opponents, eventually injuring them both before returning her husband's sword to him. Cannith smiled faintly as he recalled that duel. It was his first official duel, but had not been his last. The woman explained that because Cannith had refused the promotion offered to him and strongly insisted on her husband having the position, that their lot in life became much better. He became the personal guard to the noble house that he championed for. Cannith nodded and thanked the woman for her care before wrapping a cloak around himself and leaving. Cannith passed by the battlefield where he was betrayed by those he thought his friends, seeing the scars the land held within it and seeing just what it had to heal from in time. A number of bodies were still just lying there and decaying, with the crows picking and pecking at the remains. Cannith saw the mingled bodies of soldiers from both kingdoms left to rot, and it hurt his heart. At the very least he would have seen to it that each soldier had their own grave and proper burial rites, but obviously things were different under the leadership of Miliardo. This sight just gave him more reason to put Miliardo's head on a pike after cutting it from his shoulders. Cannith continued to walk, keeping his hood drawn up as he entered the capital city. Not one of the soldiers had bothered to stop him and check his identity, and he found that more than strange. Things were so lax that no one seemed to be doing their job. Cannith figured that if the neighboring kingdom of Gesha hadn't been in league with Miliardo, it would have already planted spies inside of the kingdom to root out more of these weaknesses and attack. But with Ho's easy betrayal came to some, that concept may still yet be something to worry about. Cannith navigated through the streets until he came to the palace, where the guards had actually bothered to do their duty and stopped him. Halt. None shall enter the palace without the express permission of the king, one of the soldiers said as he held his left hand out to stop Cannith from continuing. Make way, Cannith said as he removed his hood so that the two soldiers see who he was. The soldiers looked at each other and then at Cannith with a confused look on their faces, as they had no idea what to do. They hesitated for a bit before placing their hands upon the sheaths of their swords. No one may enter without permission of the king, the second soldier said in a more authoritative tone. The king is speaking to you, boy. Make way, Cannith said in response as his left hand went down to his sheath as well. The two soldiers were drawing their swords as Cannith was drawing his sword as well. Cannith stared at the two soldiers as they glared back at him for several moments before he grew tired of their inaction and started to walk forward. As Cannith was passing between the two of them, the guards decided to act. Both of them raised their blades and prepared to bring them down, but Cannith brought his own sword up to defend against one guard as he thrust his left leg out and kicked the other in the gut. There was an oof sound from the guard he kicked as the other guard's sword rebounded off his. Cannith rammed his shoulder into the guard in front of him and then thrust his right leg forward, striking him in the chest and toppling him over as the second guard was raising his sword and coming in. Cannith turned on his left heel and intercepted the downward stroke with his own blade. Cannith removed his left hand from his weapon and used it to reach out and grab the soldier by his right wrist and shove it to the side. This left the soldier open and vulnerable, which Cannith immediately took advantage of, bringing his own sword down in a vicious and lethal slash across the soldier's neck. Blood sprayed out of the wound for a moment, but Cannith hadn't the time to observe that with the other guard coming in to attack. This guard held both of his hands upon his sword and thrust it forward with all his might. Cannith parried the blow and countered with a diagonal slash of his own, but the guard was agile enough to jump backwards and avoid it. Cannith's sword struck the ground with a clank, and the soldier smiled uncontrollably as he felt he had a great opening that would afford him victory. The soldier ventured forward with his sword held in the air just before he was smacked in the face with the cloak that Cannith was wearing. Cannith unclasped the cloak with his left hand and threw it out in front of him. The guard stopped almost immediately to tear the cloak off and away from him, but as soon as he had thrown the cloak off, Cannith thrust his sword into the guard's stomach. Cannith pulled his sword out of the guard and knew that with this little show of loyalty that there would be other fights from now until he reached the throne room. Cannith sheathed his sword and then looked over the swords of the two dead guards while the townspeople looked at the bodies. Some of them were debating whether or not to call out for other guards, until they saw just whom was standing over the bodies. Cannith chose the sword he wanted and then fastened it to the right side of his sword belt before reclaiming his cloak and wrapping it around his shoulders again. He looked back at the people that had gathered with a stern expression that just barely held back the amount of disappointment he felt for them all. He didn't know much about how well or terribly Miliardo was ruling while Kenneth had been recovering, but he wondered about what he could have told the people to have them actually be content with him sitting on the throne. If the battlefield that he passed on his way here was any inclination of how he ruled, then it was poorly. Kenneth fought as a vicious beast with both swords in hand, slashing, stabbing, cutting and slaying his way into the throne room. The doors to the throne room burst open with Kenneth holding his two swords as a few of the guards were trying to surround him as best they could. Miliardo sat upon the throne with Juliana sitting next to him in hers. The look of shock on her face told Kenneth that she was surprised to see him alive, but he didn't know if it was because she was lied to and told that he was dead, or because she had sided with Miliardo and never expected to see him again. Miliardo looked Kenneth over. His breathing had become labored from all of the fighting, and his body was racked with a number of small injuries. Stains of blood spotted all over his garb as his eyes spat hatred and vengeance with their gaze. If he possessed the power to do so, Kenneth would have slain the both of them with just his gaze. "You may leave," Miliardo said as he was looking at the guards that had gathered around Kenneth. Miliardo knew just how dangerous Kenneth was, even in his wounded state. The number of small cuts and gashes he had sustained had in no way slowed him down. The guards looked at Miliardo and then at Kenneth, still with their weapons pointed at him. "I dislike repeating myself. Be gone," Miliardo instructed with an aggressive and annoyed tone as his hands gripped the ends of the arm rests even harder. Kenneth's gaze hadn't lessened in intensity any as the guards left begrudgingly. Juliana looked back and forth between Kenneth and Miliardo as Kenneth thrust the sword in his right hand into the floor before sheathing the weapon in his left hand, placing it in the sheath on his right side before taking up his own sword again in his right hand. "You said he was dead," Juliana said as she looked over at Kenneth. Her heart beat faster as she looked at Kenneth. Fear had gripped her heart fully. It didn't take much genius for anyone to decipher what Kenneth had in mind for the two of them. "An oversight I plan to correct," Miliardo stated as he stood up from the throne and took a few steps forward. Kenneth placed his left hand over his stomach for a moment, pressing in a few spots to see just how tender they were. Kenneth knew that Miliardo was a very competent fighter and swordsman. He couldn't afford to be slow for even a moment. He knew that meant death for him. Juliana stood up from her throne and moved off to her left. Kenneth split his attention for a moment as he looked at Juliana and then at Miliardo. Juliana had little training with a blade and didn't have a sword on her person, while Miliardo was the opposite. Kenneth and Miliardo focused on one another as they were closing the gap between each other. Miliardo drew his sword and had come down the small set of steps. Both he and Kenneth placed both of their hands upon their swords before Kenneth felt a sharp pain in his back. Something had stabbed him, a small blade. Kenneth looked a bit puzzled and searched around for Juliana but found he could not lay eyes upon her. The blade was pulled out of him and when it left his body Kenneth focused his attention on Miliardo once again. The intense look of vengeful death had yet to leave his eyes. "You hide behind the dress of a woman," Kenneth said before turning around and seeing Juliana with a dagger in her hand. She raised it up into the air, preparing to bring it down as Kenneth looked her directly in the eyes. He saw the fear in her eyes as tears rolled down her cheeks. She was afraid for herself, afraid of his wrath and didn't know what else to do. Juliana kept her hand in the air as Kenneth looked at her, his gaze softened as he looked into her eyes. Juliana saw how the expression, the emotions in Kenneth's eyes changed as they looked at one another and her hand started to slowly drift down. She was having second thoughts about what she had done. Perhaps she could have simply talked with him. That moment made Juliana rethink how much she knew about and really understood Kenneth. Miliardo watched as Juliana's hand wavered a bit. He knew that she had stabbed him from behind, but now he was waiting to see, with his sword in hand, if she had lost her nerve. Juliana's attention shifted from Kenneth to Miliardo. Kenneth could feel the bastard's shadow looming on his back and grabbed Juliana's hand. She had just enough time to look at Kenneth's hand wrapped around hers before he drove it down. Juliana's eyes went wide in surprise as she tried to pull her hand away, but found that Kenneth's grasp hadn't loosened any. Juliana looked down at her hand still wrapped around the dagger and Kenneth's hand around hers. The life was draining from his body as he smiled weakly at her. Kenneth brought his right hand up and touched the side of her face softly before all of his strength was spent. Kenneth's lifeless body tumbled to the floor and Miliardo smiled, content in seeing Kenneth dispatched for good. Juliana tried her hardest to resist screaming as she looked down at the blood on her right hand. Kenneth slipped into darkness as he felt like he was moving, not just moving, like something was pulling him. When he could find the strength to open his eyes, he found himself in a place resembling some sort of vast desert. Old and broken boats were scattered around from place to place with cacti and ashen white trees devoid of leaves. Skeletal remains were strewn about as far as he could see, with cities in different directions in the distance. A platform hung high in the air, floating, casting its shadow upon the land, and it caused Kenneth a bit of concern. Kenneth looked down and saw that the dagger was still in his chest. He pulled it out and grew angry as he figured he knew where he was, the lands of the dead. His clothes still had the bloodstains on them from all of the battles, but whatever form he was in hadn't retained the wounds from his battles, nor was he sore. Both swords were hung on either side of his belt, but he wondered what good a weapon would do him in such a place. Kenneth looked down at the dagger sticking up out of the sand and had a number of emotions crash over him like a tidal wave. There were questions that he wished he could find the answers to, but no, it seemed he never would. Kenneth looked down and saw that the dagger was still in his chest. He pulled it out and grew angry as he figured he knew where he was, the lands of the dead. His clothes still had the bloodstains on them from all of the battles, but whatever form he was in hadn't retained the wounds from his battles, nor was he sore. Both swords were hung on either side of his belt, but he wondered what good a weapon would do him in such a place. Kenneth looked down at the dagger sticking up out of the sand and had a number of emotions crash over him like a tidal wave. There were questions that he wished he could find the answers to, but no, it seemed he never would. Kenneth picked the dagger up and held it for a moment, telling himself that it was a reminder of the reason he was now in the lands of the dead, of the betrayal he had suffered, but in truth he kept it because it belonged to Juliana. He tucked it away in the front of his belt and began to walk towards one of the cities he could see in the distance. While walking, Kenneth could feel the heat of the blazing sun for some reason and sought shelter from the heat. He found a small bit of shade in the form of a large rock casting its shadow behind it. Kenneth looked at the city he was heading towards and then thought about all of the soldiers from his own kingdom that he had just sent here, and though he hadn't seen any footprints in the sand going in the same direction, Kenneth simply decided to be on his own. He had defeated the soldiers once, but should they see him, he knew that they would taunt him with claims of how Miliardo defeated him in one-to-one combat, and that would cause him to lose what little temper he had left. In the months to come, Kenneth stayed out of the cities and simply made his life as best he could in the dead lands, defeating roaming bandits and anyone that simply earned his ire that he crossed. Over a year had passed, and in that time, Kenneth had become known as Hellhound. They thought him some sort of punishment from death and feared leaving the cities without a large escort. In time he had even gained the attention of Death himself. Kenneth stood before Death in Death's floating citadel. Skeletons adorned the walls, half merged into them and posing in depicting scenes of battle, or even some sort of tragic scene that may have been a love story. Skeletons held up braziers alight with flames shifting from deep blues to purples, back and forth as Death placed his bony hands together, his own skeletal fingers touching at the tips as two tiny beads of blue glowing light peered through a skull where eyes should have been. Kenneth placed his left hand around his sword sheath as he stared back at Death with a hard gaze of his own. Death's legs visibly shifted under his robes as he crossed them right over left while leaving a long period of silence between them before speaking. "Do you know why you're here?" Death asked. Kenneth both heard and felt the words, as if they hadn't simply reached his ears, but also somehow came from inside Kenneth as well. "I know not, and I care not," Kenneth answered as he pushed up on the crossguard of his sword with his thumb. Death saw that and was actually amused by the gesture, giving a small laugh before curling his right hand into a fist and wrapping his left hand around it. "Do you honestly mean to attack me?" Death asked as he met his gaze with Kenneth's. "If need be," Kenneth answered as his right leg was slowly going behind him, preparing himself to attack if he felt the need to. "Do you think you'll succeed?" Death asked with genuine curiosity. "Not at all, but that will not stop me from attempting it nonetheless," Kenneth stated as he kept his own stern gaze upon Death. "What fills you with such anger that you would attack almost anyone that would come your way?" Death asked while getting up from his seat. "Do you know how I came to be here?" Kenneth asked in return as H started to draw his sword slowly. "I know how all of you came to be here," Death answered as he placed his hands behind his back. Then you know what fills me with such rage, Kenneth said as he finished drawing his sword, holding it with the tip facing the floor. Truly? Then what is it that you seek to possess? Death asked as he walked behind his chair and stared at the ebony wall. Vengeance, Kenneth roared. Death stared at the wall just a bit longer and bones began to surface from inside of it. They formed an oval as skeletal arms linked with one another, grasping and locking hands around wrists to form the oval. The center of the oval turned crimson for a small length of time before it rippled like water, or perhaps more accurately like a pool of blood. The color within the oval shifted and became a clear image of something, but Kenneth couldn't see what it was with death standing in the way. I will grant you a favor. I will give you the chance to seek what you're after, but I know the truth, Kenneth. What you want is not what you truly desire. When you understand my words, you will return to me, Death said as he turned away from the images in the oval and towards Kenneth. Do not presume to know of me. You may know of my death, but I doubt you can know of my life. And what do you wish in exchange for this kindness? Kenneth said as he was sheathing his sword. Death had told him that he could be returned to the lands of the living to seek his revenge. Considering the power Death had, Kenneth had no reason to think that it was simply some ploy to get him to relax his guard. To him, Death had no need for lies. A kindness? No, not a kindness. You will see that when you come to understand just what it is you truly want. You may even come to curse me someday for this, Death said with a laugh as he raised his right arm and pointed at Kenneth with his index finger. I bind you to your word, mortal soul. Seek what it is you desire most, and then when you have it, I will come to claim you. Death stated, and then there was a flash of light so bright that it blinded Kenneth. His eyes hurt as he closed them, but the sound of stone scraping against stone was what caused him to open them again. Just a few rays of light were peeking through, reaching his eyes as someone was heaving and pushing a stone slab over top of him. Kenneth felt a stinging in his chest as the slab was choking away the last of the light. The stone slab covered the top of the sarcophagus completely and gave Kenneth an idea as to where he was. In a rage, he slammed the palm of his right hand against the stone slab above him, sending it flying and tumbling through the air as he sat up. The top of his sarcophagus crashed into the stone floor and shattered, causing the two men inside to turn and face the shattered slab as Kenneth stood up and looked at his surroundings. The stinging in his chest hadn't gone away, and it was only after his initial rage had subsided for the moment that he noticed it again. Kenneth looked down at his chest to see the dagger that belonged to Juliana still in his chest. He pulled it out of his heart with his left hand, looking at it after he fully removed it. The two men that were saying something unintelligible in the background were of no concern to him for the moment as he looked the dagger over. Kenneth realized that he was in a crypt and Death had restored him to his old body, but it agitated him that they left the dagger in his chest. His clothes were in tatters and they smelled horribly. Kenneth tucked the dagger away in his belt and then felt as though something was wrong. He flexed the fingers of his left hand in and out of his palm as he tried to figure out just what felt off, and then he deduced it: his ring was gone. Now the men in the crypt with him had his attention. When he finally turned his attention to the men, one of them was running him through with a sword. Kenneth felt the sting of the blade biting and slicing into him, followed by an intense hunger the likes of which he had never dealt with before. Somehow Kenneth knew what to do to sat his hunger, as if the knowledge had been placed inside of him upon his return to the living world. Kenneth grabbed the man by the throat with his left hand and then lifted him into the air. The man started punching and striking Kenneth in the face as hard as he could, Kenneth's head turning with each blow, but felt a little dulled somehow. Kenneth squeezed the man's neck as a black aura surrounded the man. It soon started to drain away from the man, flowing from the man's body and down Kenneth's arm. As the aura flowed from one to the other, the man Kenneth was holding up was aging rapidly. His skin began to shrivel in age in seconds as if decades had passed. It took only moments to drain the life out of the man completely before Kenneth discarded the shriveled husk by throwing it off to the side. His attention fixated now on the other man attempting to beat on him with a torch. Kenneth looked at how this other man was only attacking him with one hand, and then remembered that he had a sword sticking out of his stomach. He pulled it out with his left hand and the man with the torch started to back away. Kenneth looked down at the sword and saw that it was his. This caused him to immediately look down at his sides and see that the sheaths for both of the swords he had before his death were gone. The sword he had on his right hip was to be expected as it was not his to begin with, but after pulling his own sword from his stomach made him realize just what kinds of men he was dealing with, grave robbers. Kenneth looked at the torch in the man's hand and as a flash of crimson burst through his eyes for a moment. The flames of the torch grew and engulfed the man as Kenneth stepped out of his sarcophagus. The man cried out in pain and agony as he tried his best to put the flames out, patting and beating himself with his hands as they crackled and ate away at him. A glint of light flew from the burning man's hand and fell to the ground. Kenneth looked at it and pursued it as the man continued to scream in pain for a few more moments before dropping dead on the floor of the crypt. Kenneth picked up the ring that the man dropped, seeing that it was his wedding ring, and replaced it back on his left hand. After that, Kenneth looked for the husk of the man he had drained and found the sheath of his sword. He placed the two back together and thought about just continuing on, but then remembered the tattered and very smelly clothes he had on. The drained man had no more need of his, so Kenneth disrobed him and took his clothes for his own. Kenneth fixed his sword to the left side of his belt and then looked at the entrance to the crypt. For him it would be an exit, and he wondered just how much things had changed since his death. He took the dagger in his hand and tucked it away in the front of his belt before venturing forth out of his crypt. It was night and the sky was lit with the brilliance of the stars shining down, but there was also a campfire with 3 other men around it. All 3 looked over at the entrance of the crypt when they saw someone coming out of it, and then stood at attention when they saw that someone they didn't know was coming out of it instead of the 2 men they knew went inside. Kenneth looked at them for a moment before looking around to gain a better understanding of where they had buried him. He knew the location, but only faintly. He was on the outskirts of the kingdom's borders. Apparently, no one was supposed to know where he was buried. He didn't know if that was Miliardo's doing, or Juliana's, but at the moment it didn't matter. Kenneth looked around one last time and then decided which way to go before heading in that direction. The men that were seated at the campsite gathered their weapons and rushed towards Kenneth before surrounding him. "What happened to the men that were down there?" asked the man in front of Kenneth. His tone implied that he was demanding an answer rather than simply asking for an explanation. Kenneth was silent as he looked at the man and then stepped to the side and ventured to move forward, but the man stepped in his way to stop him. "I asked you a question, blackguard," the man said as he was holding his sword with both hands. Kenneth looked at the man's sword and turned to see the other 2 men holding their swords as well. He inhaled deeply through his nose and exhaled just as deeply through his nostrils before turning his attention back towards the man that had addressed him first. Kenneth moved his right hand towards the grip of his sword, and in that moment the man stepped forward with a sword thrust. Kenneth lifted his left hand up and stared the man directly in the eye as the blade pierced through Kenneth's hand without him making a single sound. The man was a bit surprised as he stood there for a moment before Kenneth moved his left hand to his side and raised his right fist into the air. The impact of Kenneth's fist crashing against the man's skull thundered in the other 2 grave robbers' ears as the first one fell to the ground with blood pouring out of the impact point. Kenneth turned towards the other 2 and pulled the sword out of his hand, flexing his fingers in and out of his palm as the wound sealed itself up. They watched the wound seal itself, and unlike their 2 comrades from the crypt, they had the sense to not press their aggression any more than they had. They ran off into the night as Kenneth removed the sheath of the dead man in front of him, placing his new sword inside of the sheath and then hanging it from the right side of his belt before continuing on. Kenneth thought that perhaps he should have some sort of cloak or something to hide his identity, but for now it was just something he would have to deal with. The one thing he had going in his favor was that everyone knew he was dead. He is sure that Miliardo would have seen to that to solidify his rule. Most would see him as some sort of lookalike, or perhaps some sort of relative. The former would be of great use to him, while the latter would cause him some sort of trouble with those that were following Miliardo gleefully. And then Kenneth had a thought: pretend to be a leper. Wrap and envelop himself with layers of rags and hobble around a bit when people saw him to create the ruse that he may be far less capable than he actually was. Kenneth began tearing the clothes off of his latest victim, tearing holes in them and wrapping himself in them. This made him think back to what he was wearing when he woke up and feeling the need to don garb that wasn't as tattered. It seemed a bit foolish now after he had come up with a plan to move about unhindered. The next portion of his plot involved Kenneth severing a hand from one of the men that he killed before cutting and carving small portions of flesh from the arm. Kenneth then took small scoops of dirt and rubbed it into the severed arm. After that was all done, Kenneth held onto the arm by a bone sticking out of it and pulled it into his sleeve to aid in giving him the appearance of being a dirty and diseased person. He made his way back into the capital, shuffling and pretending to be limp of limbs when it suited him. Kenneth made his way towards the castle, navigating through the streets fairly easily as most people shied away from him after looking at the severed limb he had protruding from his sleeve. He stopped at the entrance to the castle, looking at the guards posted. There were just a few of them standing at their posts as Kenneth stood there, hunched over with his arms drawn in. One of the guards approached Kenneth with his left hand on his sword. "Move along," the guard said before looking at the gnarled right arm. "Leper, I'm simply a humble person, trying to give a gift to the queen," Kenneth said before reaching into his right sleeve. The guard took hold of his sword, ready to draw it as Kenneth withdrew a single blue rose from inside of his sleeve with his left hand. He purposely had his hand be a bit shaky as he presented the flower to the guard. "No one wants this garbage," the guard said as he crushed the rose in his hand. Kenneth looked at the crushed rose and then at the guard. "We couldn't let him in with those swords anyway," one of the other guards said. "The way his hands shake, I doubt he could even hold the damned things," the first guard said as he looked back at the other for a moment and then turned his attention back to Kenneth. "You'd be surprised," Kenneth said as he stood up straight and grabbed the first guard by the throat with his left hand and lifted him off the ground. The other guards took their swords in hand, but looked on in shock and horror as they watched a black aura surround their comrade and his body rapidly shrink. The guard's skin became wrinkled and his body withering away into a mummified husk before Kenneth tossed the husk aside and looked at the others. Kenneth dropped the severed limb to the ground as his attention settled on the other two guards. "I'm still hungry," Kenneth said with a wicked grin as he began shedding layers of rags. The guards ran off, calling for aid as Kenneth marched inside with his swords in hand. Screams of torture and the last cries of dying men pierced through the halls as Kenneth continued to walk straight to the throne room. Miliardo and Juliana were looking at Kenneth as he held a soldier in his left hand. They watched as Kenneth drained the man of his vital essence, seeing the man's body shrink and wither as Kenneth focused his attention on Miliardo. Kenneth tossed the husk aside and stepped further into the throne room with his sword in his right hand. Miliardo looked at Kenneth with a look of annoyance rather than anything resembling surprise, while Juliana was terrified at the sight of Kenneth. She felt that his desire for revenge, the hate that he must have had for her, was so powerful that even death couldn't keep him from what he wanted. "You and I have unfinished business," Kenneth said as he pointed up towards Miliardo with his left hand. "Yes, I suppose we do," Miliardo said as he started to get up from his throne. Miliardo took his sword up in hand, but Kenneth couldn't help but to notice the strange amulet that Miliardo was wearing. It resonated with him for some reason he didn't understand, but then again at this moment he didn't really care about. Juliana didn't know what to do. Fear had stricken her paralyzed in her own throne. Kenneth felt the flow of all the people he had drained rushing through him as he glared up at Miliardo, his body becoming enveloped in a dark aura for a moment before his garb was changed back to the black armored garb he was wearing the day he died. "Much better," Kenneth stated before he rushed up the steps of the throne in a blur of black. Miliardo already had his sword out and managed to defend himself, his blade clashing with Kenneth's with a loud clang. Miliardo looked unimpressed as he and Kenneth locked gazes with one another. Miliardo lifted his leg and kicked Kenneth down the steps leading up to the throne. Kenneth rolled down the stairs before pushing himself up into a crouching position at the bottom. Miliardo raced down the steps in a streak of blurring royal blue, thrusting his sword forward at Kenneth's chest. Kenneth slashed with his sword from right to left, knocking Miliardo's sword off target before Kenneth shot up from the ground and grabbed him by the throat. Kenneth lifted Miliardo into the air and tried to siphon off his life force, but found much to his surprise that he couldn't. Kenneth looked a bit perplexed as the amulet on Miliardo's neck gave off a faint glow. Miliardo ran his sword into Kenneth's chest, causing Kenneth to drop Miliardo before stumbling back a few steps and falling to one knee. "I've had this charm made to anchor my soul to this world if I ever had to cross swords with you. It more or less makes me immortal. Luck to you on besting me," Miliardo said with a devious laugh while Kenneth was removing the sword from his chest. With what Miliardo had just admitted, Juliana knew that he planned on killing, or at least betraying Kenneth for some time. Kenneth tossed the sword aside, but Miliardo placed his hands together at his palms and separated them. An aura of blue light floated in the space between his hands before dying off to reveal a sword that he took in hand. The wound on Kenneth's chest closed as an aura of black energy surrounded the wound and disappeared as soon as the wound closed. The two of them rushed at each other and clashed with their blades, sparks leaping from their swords with each strike blocked and defended against one another. Their swords were chipping and cracking with each strike that clashed against one another. Their swords shattered with one final blow, tossing shards of their blades all around before they stabbed each other with the broken remains of their weapons. Both grunted before clenching their teeth at one another. Kenneth pulled his sword out of Miliardo and then went to stab him again, grabbing him by the tunic. Miliardo drew his left hand back and then launched it at Kenneth, striking him in the jaw and sending him to the floor before forcing him to roll a few times before he positioned himself in another crouching stance. Miliardo looked at Kenneth and started towards him while placing his palms together, but something was different this time. Miliardo couldn't feel the flow of energy surge through him like he had for so many years. He separated his hands, but nothing had happened, no glow, no sword. Lose something? Kenneth asked as he held up the amulet with a broken chain in his left hand. Miliardo looked down at his chest and then at the amulet in Kenneth's grasp, and dread immediately fell upon him. He was vulnerable and no longer anchored to this realm. The pains of where Kenneth had stabbed him suddenly set in, and Miliardo's legs grew weaker by the moment. Soon they could no longer support the weight of his body and collapsed under him, forcing him to the ground as Kenneth was standing up. Kenneth tossed the amulet off to the side as Miliardo was clutching at his wounds, doing his best to stop the bleeding. Kenneth held his right hand out and began channeling the stolen life force of the men he fed upon. A black aura surrounded his hand and then extended into a sword before dissipating back into nothingness. Miliardo was crawling on his hands and knees as he attempted to get away as fast as he could. Kenneth easily caught up with him, grabbing Miliardo by the back of his tunic and then shoving him face first into the floor. Kenneth held him in place before skewering him with his sword. Miliardo screamed out in pain before the life finally left his body and he went limp. Blood oozed out of the wound and pooled around his body on the stone floor before Kenneth turned his attention from Miliardo to Juliana, as soon as he felt the life leave Miliardo's body. A stern look that one could easily take for anger took hold of his expression as he tore his sword out of Miliardo's body and sheathed it. Juliana looked at Kenneth as he marched towards her with tears in her eyes. Kenneth, I'm sorry. He told me you were dead and then I saw a decree that said he should be king. It was signed by you, or so I thought. When you appeared, I was scared. I thought you'd never give me the chance to tell you what had happened. I saw the rage in your eyes. What else was I to do? Kenneth, I'm sorry. Juliana ranted as the strength left her legs as well. She fell down with Kenneth standing before her. She wept with her hand up to make some sort of defensive gesture, for whatever good it would do her. Kenneth stared down at her and then looked just off to his left side. Kenneth simply stared at her without a word as she continued to hold her hand up defensively. After a time, Juliana realized that Kenneth had no intentions of striking her down and slowly moved her hand down to her side. She stared up at him with tears still streaming down the side of her face. The stern expression he held since she had witnessed him march into the throne room had softened considerably as his eyes studied her face. What are you doing? Juliana asked in a confused manner as she looked up at Kenneth. Simply letting mine eyes drink in beauty, unmatched to me, Kenneth said with a soft tone as he looked down at her. I don't understand, Juliana stated. Since the very day that I met you, you've been one of the most beautiful creatures that has ever graced my vision. Kenneth stated with a smile before realizing death's true terms. I have what I wanted. I understand now, you can claim me. Kenneth called out. Juliana looked up at him with confusion before she looked around to see if anyone else was around in the throne room with them. I know you can hear me. Take me back, Kenneth roared as he looked around a bit. Sometime after, a swirling vortex of black appeared in the center of the room and began to grow. At the edges of the vortex, bone arms manifested, holding on to one another in a circular pattern. Death floated through the portal, hovering over the floor just in front of the portal. Kenneth turned and beheld Death for a few moments before facing Juliana again. He inhaled deeply and then exhaled just as deeply, taking his time looking her over before starting down the steps towards the portal. Kenneth stopped in front of the portal, staring at it for a few moments before turning his gaze towards Death. You knew what I truly wanted all along, didn't you? Kenneth asked, but Death was silent as he looked down at Kenneth. The silence between them was all of the answer Kenneth needed. He was sure that Death did indeed know what it was that he wanted in his heart all along. Bastard, Kenneth said, and then jumped through the portal back into the lands of the dead. Juliana looked at Kenneth and Death and could hear what Kenneth had said to Death. Lord Death, what is it that he truly wished for? Juliana asked. In her heart she was sure that Kenneth's defiance of Death was merely for revenge, to strike down those he felt had wronged him, but that thought was proven incorrect as she was still alive. Truly, child? Death said as a wicked smile somehow formed over his bony face. He wanted nothing more than to see you again. He told himself that he simply sought revenge to lie to himself. I knew the truth, and now so do you. That man still loves you dearly. It's strong enough to defy even me. Death said with a small laugh before floating through the portal. Juliana felt as if she had been struck in the chest as a great pain had entered her heart. For all of the years they had spent together, it was just in that moment she came to realize that perhaps she hadn't known Kenneth as well as she thought. The concept of his love for her defying even death hurt more than any wound that could have been inflicted upon her at the time. She screamed and then wept into the floor, ashamed of herself as the vortex closed. The end.